Hey, music lovers out there. If you're anything like me, you love a good music history deep dive. You know what I mean? Especially when it comes to those little-known stories and connections between artists.
Absolutely. And that's what makes today's deep dive so fascinating.
Today, we're going to explore the wild world of Bill Haley and His Comets, a band that's often overshadowed, but played an absolutely essential role in the birth of rock and roll.
They're a fascinating case study.
Yeah.
Because they didn't just ride the rock and roll wave. They were right there at the beginning, helping to create it.
Exactly. And to guide our exploration, we'll be using their Wikipedia page as our main source.
Buckle up, because you're about to uncover some surprising facts about this iconic band.
Oh, I bet. Did you know that Bill Haley spoke fluent Spanish?
No way! I had no idea.
Yeah, and get this. Their music was so wild, it caused a near riot in London. They called it the Second Battle of Waterloo. Crazy, right?
Wow, that's incredible. But here's another one for you. Before they were rock and roll pioneers, they were actually a country and western band.
Yeah, that's right. They started as Bill Haley and the Saddlemen, playing in honky-tonks and dance halls. It's amazing to think that a country crooner could become a rock and roll icon. What a transformation.
Well, you have to consider the musical scene back in the early 50s genres were much more fluid. Artists like Haley were experimenting, blending country, western swing, and rhythm and blues. What we now call R&B.
It was like a musical melting pot. And Haley wasn't the only one stirring things up. Think about Chuck Berry. He was doing something similar, pulling from country and blues to create his own style of rock and roll.
Absolutely. And you can hear those influences in their early recordings. Take Rocket 88 from 1951, a song that's often considered one of the very first rock and roll hits. Haley's version still had a strong country flavor, but with a driving beat that hinted at the rock and roll revolution to come.
And that revolution really kicked off
Right.
with their first national hit, Crazy Man Crazy, in 1953.
That was a landmark moment, It was the first rock and roll song to ever be played on national television.
Can you imagine seeing that for the first time back then? It must have been mind-blowing.
Oh, I bet it was. Think about it. This was before Elvis. Before Chuck Berry became household names, television brought rock and roll right into people's living rooms, reaching a much larger audience than radio ever could. And get this, a young James Dean was even on the same show that night. Talk about a recipe for a cultural phenomenon.
Speaking of iconic songs, no deep dive into Bill Haley. His Comets would be complete without mentioning Rock Around the Clock, recorded in 1954.
It's funny, Rock Around the Clock didn't become a smash hit right away. It took a while to gain traction, but then it just exploded, selling 25 million copies. It's one of those songs that truly captures the rebellious spirit and raw energy of early rock and roll.
And let's not forget about the incredible musicianship on that track. Danny Cedrone, the session guitarist who played that iconic solo that everyone knows and loves. Sadly, he died just a few days after recording it. A tragic story.
It really adds another layer to the song's legacy when you know the story behind it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when we talk about early rock and roll, we can't ignore the influence of R&B, especially the music of black artists. Haley covered Big Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle, and Roll in 1954, and his version actually outsold the original.
Haley's version is a fascinating example because it highlights the complexities of race and music in that era. He toned down some of the more suggestive lyrics and kind of smoothed out the rough edges of the rhythm, making it more palatable for a mainstream, predominantly white audience.
It definitely raises questions about how white artists covering black artists' songs both helped to popularize R&B, but also benefited from a system that often marginalized black musicians. It's a complex issue. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about a film that played a pivotal role in launching rock and roll into the stratosphere, Blackboard Jungle.
Oh yeah, that opening scene with Rock Around the Clock blasting as those kids are walking to school, it's iconic. It perfectly captured the rebellious energy of rock and roll and its impact on youth culture.
It wasn't just the music either, it was the whole visual package. Haley with his kiss curl, the band in their matching suits, Marshall Lytle riding his upright bass like a horse, and Joey Ambrose's wild saxophone playing, jumping all over the stage. They were a spectacle.
They brought a raw energy and visual excitement that was totally new, and as you can imagine, it terrified a lot of parents at the time.
Oh, absolutely. But of course, as with many bands, there were lineup changes over the years, and eventually their popularity started to decline, especially as newer acts like Elvis Presley and Little Richard burst onto the scene.
Yeah, the music scene was evolving rapidly. Elvis brought a more overtly sexual energy, and Little Richard's wild stage presence and powerful vocals were unlike anything anyone had seen before. It was a natural progression, but it meant that Haley's clean-cut image started to feel a bit dated.
But here's the thing. Even as their popularity dipped in the US, their international success was exploding. Remember that Second Battle of Waterloo we talked about earlier? That was in London in 1957. Thousands of fans went absolutely crazy for them.
It's amazing to think about their global reach at a time when international travel wasn't nearly as common as it is today. It shows just how powerful the appeal of rock and roll was and how it transcended cultural boundaries.
It really is fascinating. And speaking of breaking boundaries, you mentioned earlier that Bill Haley spoke fluent Spanish.
Oh, yeah. And that's a whole other chapter in their story. That deserves a deep dive of its own. Haley's fluency in Spanish really opened up a whole new world for the band. It wasn't just about performing for Spanish-speaking audiences. It was about embracing the culture and creating music that resonated with those audiences on a much deeper level.
It really speaks to their willingness to push beyond what was familiar and connect with people from all walks of life. So tell me more about this Latin American adventure. Where did it all begin?
Well, their big breakthrough in Latin America came in the late 50s, particularly in Mexico. They were already pretty popular there, thanks to the global spread of rock and roll. But Haley's ability to speak Spanish and the band's willingness to incorporate Latin rhythms into their music, it really took things to a whole new level.
So they weren't just playing American rock and roll. They were fusing it with the sounds of Mexico, creating something truly unique. I bet the audiences love that.
Oh, absolutely. They were selling out stadiums. And get this, they even earned the nickname Kings of the Twist in Mexico.
The Kings of the Twist.
Yeah, it was a twist on the American dance craze, but with a Latin flavor.
That's amazing. It's incredible how they managed to adapt their music to fit different cultural contexts while still staying true to their rock and roll roots. It speaks volumes about their versatility and their ability to connect with such diverse audiences.
And it wasn't just about adapting their existing songs. They were writing and recording original material in Spanish, like Twist Español, which became one of the best-selling records in Mexican history.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm starting to see why this part of their story deserves its own deep dive. They weren't just performing in Mexico, they were becoming a part of the musical landscape.
Exactly. They were collaborating with local musicians, incorporating traditional instruments like trumpets and maracas into their sound, really immersing themselves in the culture.
It's a beautiful reminder that music has this incredible power to bridge cultural divides. It's a universal language that can bring people together, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs.
And it wasn't just Mexico either. Their popularity spread throughout Latin America. They were touring extensively, performing for huge crowds in Argentina, Chile, Peru, and beyond.
They were truly international superstars, spreading the gospel of rock and roll to every corner of the world.
Yeah.
But their impact went beyond live performances, right? Didn't they also make a significant mark on the film industry?
Oh, absolutely. Blackboard Jungle was just the beginning. They went on to star in two of the earliest rock and roll movies, Rock Around the Clock and Don't Knock the Rock, both released in 1956.
Those films captured the energy and rebellious spirit of rock and roll culture and helped solidify its place in the mainstream. It wasn't just about showcasing the music, it was about presenting a whole new way of life, a new attitude.
And they did it with a sense of fun and humor. Haley's charisma on screen and the band's infectious energy, it was impossible to resist. They were like the original rock and roll rebels, challenging social norms and inspiring a generation of teenagers to let loose and express themselves.
It's fascinating to see how they transitioned from country music to become these global icons, influencing everything from fashion to film to social attitudes. Their reach extended far beyond the music itself.
And it's important to remember that all of this was happening against the backdrop of a rapidly changing world. The post-war era was a time of social upheaval and cultural shifts, and rock and roll became the soundtrack for a generation yearning for something new and exciting.
They were at the forefront of a cultural revolution. Their music gave voice to the hopes and anxieties of a generation coming of age in a world on the brink of transformation.
And it's a legacy that continues to resonate today. Their music might have been born in the 1950s, but its energy and spirit still feel so relevant. It's a reminder that great music has the power to transcend time and connect with people across generations.
So we've talked about their American success, their global impact, their influence on film, and their deep connection with Latin America. What other surprises does the story of Bill Haley and His Comets hold? Is there anything else that stands out to you as particularly fascinating or unexpected?
Well, as we've been discussing their global reach and musical versatility, it's really striking how Bill Haley and his Comets weren't afraid to experiment and blend different styles. They weren't purists in any sense of the word.
Yeah, that's true. It's like they were always pushing boundaries and trying new things.
And that actually brings us to another fascinating aspect of their musical journey, one that often gets overlooked. Remember how we talked about their success in Latin America and Haley's fluency in Spanish?
Oh yeah, that's a side of their story that I find so intriguing. It really highlights their openness to embracing other cultures.
Well, it goes even deeper than that. They didn't just sing in Spanish, they incorporated Latin American musical elements into their sound. Believe it or not, there's a recording of Haley singing a country ballad with a full mariachi band backing him up.
Wait a minute, a mariachi band? Really? That's not what I would have expected at all. What song was it?
It was a Spanish version of 13 Women, one of their earlier hits. They transformed it into a ranchera, a traditional Mexican folk song style.
13 Women as a ranchera. Wow.
You can hear the trumpets, violins, and guitars blending with Haley's vocals, creating this unique fusion of American rock and roll and Mexican folk music.
That's incredible. I'm starting to understand why people call them musical chameleons. They could adapt to any style and make it their own.
It speaks to their deep musicality and their ability to connect with audiences on such a fundamental level, regardless of language or cultural background.
So it wasn't just about translating their songs into Spanish. It was about truly engaging with the music of that region. It makes me wonder if they incorporated influences from other cultures as well during their international tours.
That's a great question. It's certainly possible, Unfortunately, the recordings from that era aren't as well documented, so we may never know the full extent of their musical explorations. But the mariachi example really is a testament to their adventurous spirit and their willingness to push creative boundaries.
It's a great reminder that musical innovation often happens when artists step outside of their comfort zones and embrace those new influences. It's about cross-pollination and collaboration.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing the universality of music. At its core, music is about emotion, rhythm, and storytelling. Those elements can be found in every culture around the world. And Bill Haley and his Comets truly understood that. They used it to connect with people on a global scale.
Their story is so much more than just the hits and the fame. It's about musical exploration, cultural exchange, and the enduring power of rock and roll to transcend boundaries.
Couldn't have said it better myself. They were pioneers in so many ways, paving the way for countless artists who followed in their footsteps. They helped break down musical barriers, introduced rock and roll to the world, and left behind a legacy that continues to inspire.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring their story.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Bill Haley and his Comets, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
I hope they come away with a sense of curiosity and wonder about the rich tapestry of music history. I hope they're inspired to dig deeper, explore new genres, and discover those hidden connections between different musical styles and cultures. There's a whole world